Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the last day of the North American Ag Roundtable. This is a great discussion today that we're about to have. It's the USMCA, the new Nafta, and its impact. And we have a great panel lined up today. And I want to introduce you to Al Mussel, who is our moderator today. He's the research lead at Agri-Food Economic Systems from Guelph. And I want to give Al a big thank you for helping me with this topic. He's been a really great source of knowledge for me and direction. This is not my strong suit in policy, so it's been really great to be able to work with him through this. So it's a very important topic, and definitely, anybody in the industry needs some insight on what's happening. So Al, I will pass it over to you. And also we'll be taking questions. So throughout, if you have a question, type out the question, and I'll be asking the questions near the end at around 11:50.
Oh, very good. Thanks. Thanks very much, Chrissy. And welcome everyone to our session on the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement in Agriculture and Food. As Chrissy mentioned, I'm Al Mussel. I'm a Canadian agricultural researcher with Agri-Food Economic Systems, focusing on ag marketing, trade, and agricultural policy. And I'm pleased to serve as a moderator this morning. We do have a remarkable panel of experts to inform our topic this morning. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and I'll get back to them in a moment. Joe Glauber is with us. Joe is with the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and is also the former chief economist with the USDA, and he brings an exceptional expertise in agricultural trade. We have Darren Baxt from the Institute for Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, which is also located in Washington, and an expert in U.S. ag and trade policy. And we have J.P. Gervais, who is the Vice President of Ag Economics and Valuation, and also the Chief Economist at Farm Credit Canada. J.P. is also a former professor of agricultural economics at North Carolina State University and Laval University. So I'll turn to our panel in a moment, but I thought I'd start by maybe trying to frame the issue a little bit in ag and food. The USMCA was signed by the three member countries in the fall of 2018. The negotiation of this agreement was consistent with the campaign pledge made by Donald Trump prior to the election of 2016 to renegotiate or withdraw the United States from NAFTA. In the intervening period, and both prior to and since the signing of the USMCA, the trade agendas of the US, Canada, and Mexico have drifted considerably, especially in agriculture and food. In early 2017, the U.S. withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Subsequent to this, the remaining 11 parties formed the CPTPP. Starting in 2018, the U.S. enacted multiple duties on imported steel and aluminum, affecting a number of countries, including Canada, Mexico, and China, triggering trade retaliation against the U.S. To a large extent on agricultural and food products. In particular, China targeted U.S. pork and soybeans with retaliatory duties. In the ensuing period, U.S. farm prices softened from these retaliatory trade actions, creating pressure for subsidy payments, and large farm program payments were made under the market facilitation program in 2018, 2019, and 2020. The U.S. and Japan established a trade arrangement in 2019 that provided market access for U.S. agri-food products to the Japanese market, similar to what the U.S. would have obtained under TPP, and placed the U.S. on similar footing as the CPTPP countries with regard to market access in Japan, but without providing Japan with reciprocal or comparable market access in the United States. In early 2020, the first stage U.S.-China agreement was concluded that provided for large purchases of a range of U.S. agri-food products by China, create expansions in market access, some which are new, so for example, U.S. beef, and provided some aspects of food regulatory harmonization between the United States and China. Political and economic tension has grown between the U.S. and China over issues that I think probably everybody is well familiar with. The coronavirus, governance in Hong Kong, information technology and high tech. These and other issues have also created Canada-China tensions. The WTO appellate body is now unable to appoint dispute resolution panelists, leaving countries to agree on auxiliary measures for dispute resolution in international trade, as some have, including Canada, or otherwise without any final means of trade dispute resolution. This has occurred under pressure from the US. So it was in this context that the USMCA came into force on July 1st of this year. The major provisions in agriculture and food included the following. Expansion of US access to the Canadian market in dairy and poultry products. The US also provided Canada with increased market access to the US in its dairy products. Canada agreed to constraints on exports and pricing of certain dairy products. Canada agreed to grading standards for grain varieties approved in Canada and exported from the United States to Canada that didn't previously exist. So with that preamble, I'll turn now to the panelists for their introductory remarks on USMCA and associated issues in ag and food trade. I'll look to remarks for about 5 to 7 minutes from each panelist, and then I have some questions to pose to the panel, and then we'll follow up with Q&A from our registrants that are online. So first, I'll start with Joe Glauber. Joe, some of your remarks?
Great. Well, thanks, Al. First, I'd like to say thanks to the North American Roundtable for the kind invitation to be here. I think the last 4 years have been fairly frenetic for U.S. trade policy, and not necessarily in a good way. I think, Al, you did a nice job kind of laying out all the high points or low points, as it were. There's been so much happening in trade policy that it's easy to forget that USMCA or CUSMA or Nafta 2.0 even happened. And maybe that's because for US agriculture, at least, I think USMCA has been less consequential, mainly because NAFTA has worked so well, and what we see in USMCA is not all that different. I wrote an essay back in late 2018, just after the agreement had been signed, calling it the Emperor's New NAFTA. Mostly, I said so mostly because the good news was that it preserved market access gains achieved in the original NAFTA. It was modernized, which after 25 years was needed, but it was meant but what that meant was essentially that many of the provisions that we gave up by pulling out of TPP were inserted into the new USMCA. All this was a good thing, by the way. Although there's a certain irony in taking what the president has called one of the worst trade agreements ever negotiated, that is NAFTA, and improving it with provisions with the disastrous TPP agreement to make it a hallmark achievement for his administration. But hey, politics is politics. I think there's certainly market access gains for U.S. dairy. You mentioned the provisions on grain standards. Market access for poultry and eggs, although how consequential all this really remains to be seen. I think likewise access for Canadian dairy, peanuts, and sugar are another thing. Again, these were all tied to increases in TRQs, no real tariff reductions, and actually what we saw in market access gains was essentially similar to what we had been negotiated during the TPP negotiations. No, I think the bigger news was that a lot of bad stuff was avoided. Seasonal tariffs were advocated by producers in Florida and some southeastern states. I think Darren may touch on this later. And then you had things like country of origin labeling, which after having lost a decision at the WTO, when the Trump administration came in, there were a lot of interests, northern tier cattle producers, et cetera, who came back in and said, well, maybe this is a chance to push for putting in cool into a new NAFTA agreement. But they didn't make it into the USMCA, although I think, as we'll see, that I think interests are still very keen in getting some of that back on the agenda, the trade agenda here. Not surprising, I think, when the USITC, that is the International Trade Commission, analyzed the agreement, they concluded that the benefits would be very small to the, compared to the old NAFTA. But the threat was, if there was no new NAFTA, would the president attempt to terminate the old NAFTA? And I think that's an interesting counterfactual that thankfully we don't have to consider. I think that would have really been a disaster. A good outcome for all of this, however, was the sizable majority by which the legislation sailed through Congress. And believe me, after watching trade agreements get passed by Congress by the slimmest margins possible, some of the previous FTAs like CAFTA and other things, extensions of Trade Promotion Authority, I think a lot of credit goes to Trade Rep Lighthizer and the work he did with bringing the Democrats on board. But I'd also like to think that a lot of the yes votes were by members who actually saw the value in NAFTA and saw the value for preserving this agreement, because again, I think this is an agreement that's worked very, very well for U.S. agriculture. I think what's frustrating for me is unfortunately how much time we took to get these negotiations done. I mean, after all, if you think that if we had passed TPP, a lot of this would have been accomplished based on where we were at the beginning of the 2017, and again, not with and that would have been done without the costs. Al mentioned the tariff actions taken against steel and aluminum and the sort of counter retaliations that essentially were leveled by a lot of countries at U.S. agriculture, and I think that we were hurt a lot from that. I think, this is also true with the trade war that we've had with China. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of problems with China that need to be addressed, intellectual property, business practices. But I think unilateral actions have just led to counter retaliations and loss of export markets. And right now, after phase one, none of the original complaints, that is intellectual property, business practices, et cetera, have yet to really be addressed. So we've gone through a lot to kind of get back to kind of where we were in 2017. I think the phase one agreement brought some new provisions which will help facilitate trade. They're less talked about. I think what really caught the attention were sort of the sexy trade targets that were announced for 2020 and 2021, the raising it to $36.5 billion up to $50 billion. But if you look at but it looks like U.S. exports at the end of the day are going to get back to 2017 levels this year, far short of the targets laid out. But I think this is a good thing. It sort of gets these things back to trade that we were seeing that has grown over time, and I think will continue to grow over time. But I think if you really want to see ag exports grow, the thing you need to do is work on the structural elements like tariffs and SPS provisions and non-tariff barriers. I think setting arbitrary trade targets like what we saw in phase one remind me a lot of the old long-term grain agreements that we had with the Soviet Union. They never lasted that long, actually. Oftentimes less than it took for the ink to dry on them. And then lastly, I think it's really important for the U.S. to re-engage in the WTO. The problems with the appellate body have been around for some time. I think the Obama administration certainly also was concerned about them. But I think it's time, if the U.S. really wants to reform, it's time to get pushing on what we want in those reforms. I think we did a good job of getting and can take credit for getting everyone's attention. I think there's a lot of countries now who are engaged on trying to get a reform through that will work. But I think it's really time for U.S. leadership to step up and to work with like-minded countries like Canada and others to get a reform in the WTO, because I think ultimately this is a system that's worked very well for the U.S. Just looking at the cases involving agriculture, I think 80% of the claims that we've made in cases involving agriculture, we've won. And so this is very important, and I think that is something that we need to consider. I think there's still a lot to do in agricultural negotiations, and a lot that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, a lot of objectives that we share and have in common. That is in terms of increasing market access, lowering trade barriers, and reducing trade distorting domestic support. Well, let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Very good. Thanks. Thanks for your comments, Joe. Very informative. Darren, can we go to you next?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I appreciate the invitation to speak today. So agriculture trade with Canada and Mexico is critical for the United States. And that was clear going into the Nafta renegotiations. And just for the sake of time, let me just focus on some exports data. So in nominal dollars, U.S. agriculture exports to Canada were $5.3 billion in 1993, the year before implementation of Nafta. In 2016, that number had nearly quadrupled to $20.3 billion. In 1993, U.S. ag exports to Mexico were $3.6 billion and increased almost 5 times to $17.9 billion in 2016. So to provide additional context about the agriculture trade importance of both Canada and Mexico for the United States. Now, while Canada was the largest ag export market for the US in 2016, Canada and Mexico were the second and third largest. So the total US ag exports to both Canada and Mexico, if you add those together, were greater than the next 9 largest ag export markets combined. So let's look at some state-based data. Canada or Mexico in 2016 was the top agricultural export market for an incredible 37 states and a top 3 market for every state except Hawaii and Washington. There were 31 states in which Canada and Mexico were both a top 3 market, including states as different as Iowa and Rhode Island. So you can kind of see why there was a constant mantra in agriculture at the time regarding NAFTA renegotiations. And that mantra was first, do no harm. And USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue echoed that point. USMCA in the food and agriculture context appears to have met this low bar. And I want to briefly highlight 2 USMCA agriculture issues that don't get as much attention, but are very important. Some of the highlights have already been discussed already, so I won't repeat them. So I'll just 2. First, NAFTA didn't include provisions dealing with agricultural biotechnology. The USMCA specifically addresses critical biotechnology innovations in agriculture, and it helps ensure that there are clear and timely approval processes for such technologies among the member countries. Unlike TPP, the USMCA appears to provide coverage for many more future innovations, such as gene editing. Second, there's the issue of sanitary and phytosanitary means just plant-based measures. So these measures help to ensure a safe food supply and protect the health of animals and plants. But the challenge is, in the international trade context, is making sure that countries apply these measures for legitimate health and safety reasons and not as an excuse to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. What makes it tricky, though, is that there's no real way to ascertain the intent of a country when it develops these measures. In other words, there's no way to know whether it's really for health reasons or protectionist reasons. So by requiring a country to demonstrate that there's a strong scientific basis for any measure, it better ensures the regulation is not a protectionist scheme, and further, that it's justified to achieve a legitimate or health safety objective. And NAFTA did have a chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary measures before, but the USMCA builds upon the existing chapter, and it should help to better ensure the use of sound science. Now, as we examine the USMCA, one key way to review it is whether key provisions can help to shape and improve the international rules of the game, including on timely and developing non-tariff trade barriers, such as biotechnology. I think the manner in which some of these agricultural non-tariff trade barriers are addressed in the USMCA looks to be a success on this front. Now, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and discuss the U.S. trade aid to farmers that's been mentioned. In response to U.S. tariffs, China imposed retaliatory tariffs on about 800 food and agricultural products. So then, in response to China's response to the U.S. response, the U.S. in 2018 was reportedly going to do a one-time relief package for farmers of $12 billion. Now, as was expected, kind of like the sun rising, it wasn't a one-time deal. Less than a year later, the USDA was already lining up more trade aid payments. These payments include something called the market facilitation payments that were discussed, and that covers most of the cost of the trade aid. There's also something called the Food Purchase and Distribution Program, which buys up surplus commodities. And then there's a relatively small agricultural trade promotion program. Now, here's kind of a big concern with all these programs when it comes to trade, besides the fact that when the tariffs themselves are kind of the US shooting ourselves in the foot, and then the trade aid is also kind of us shooting ourselves in the foot. It's like having one bad policy on top of another bad policy. But here's the other issue. But by using this trade aid, it can start to become the means to effectively bake into US trade policy the use of tariffs. So in other words, imposing tariffs becomes no big deal because the trade aid could be perceived as a way to help offset any harm for farmers, and who knows, maybe other groups in the future. Further, the tariffs and the trade aid just build on top of each other layer by layer, and soon people forget why the original bad policies existed in the first place. So kind of just briefly to conclude, I think the USMCA is something that does help agriculture, but there's a lot of uncertainty right now in agricultural trade. And that uncertainty is a bad thing for farmers or ranchers who need to be able to plan for the future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
All right, thanks very much, Darren. I'll turn now to JP Gervais.
Okay, thanks, Al. Thanks. I'm going to pick up where Darren left off, actually talking about the uncertainty and all the disruptions that are occurring with regards to trade. I'm going to offer a Canadian perspective that's going to be rooted on what I've heard over the last few years from our customers. So for those of you that are not familiar with the farm credit system in Canada, it's quite similar to the one that exists in the United States. Similar, but also quite a few differences, but basically is FCC or Farm Credit Canada offers financial services across the entire supply chain. So going back to 2016, which is also where Al picked up the story when it came to trade negotiations, I think it's an understatement to say that the threat of seeing the United States withdraw from Nafta has created quite a bit of anxiety then. I can recall for sure that some of the discussions then occurring right around at the same time as Canada was just launching a major strategy in terms of, or at the time, I don't think the strategy was launched, but certainly we were working towards setting some very ambitious targets when it comes to trade, seeing ag and food as a major engine of growth in the country. And so you can imagine then when you're starting to discuss losing access to your most important market, that becomes quite a bit of anxiety from business owners, and to think about like the possibility of losing access to the U.S. market. I know this is not the really great forum to bombard you with numbers, but I'd like to point out that the U.S., out of the $28 billion worth of farm products that we export, the U.S. accounts for about 55% of this. Almost 90% of our livestock that we export is to the U.S. Crops is a little bit lower, but the U.S. is such a big market when it comes to exports. It's also one of the things that sometimes is under the radar a little bit, but given the integration of so many supply chains in North America, for us, the U.S. market, the fact to have free trade at the border is a big deal when it comes to price signals. Anytime you add costs, the most obvious one being a tariff, but any non-tariff barriers, any type of transaction costs added at the border in a way that it results in what I call a thickening of the border, it obscures the price signals and makes the life of everybody in the supply chain a lot harder, the business life, the decisions to invest and so forth. And so I think CUSMA is a big deal as well. I keep just for the sake of clarity here, I keep referring to CUSMA, but we're talking about the same thing, right? So both sides of the border use a little bit of a different acronym. So bottom line is big market. If you look at processed food, 70% of the 36 billion or so that we exported in 2019, 70% is going to the United States. And if you focus just on the value add, it's close to 90% of what we export that goes to the US. So absolutely critical to get to preserve the market access that we have in the US. But the one narrative that I'm not such a big fan of is the narrative that, Canada's win was not to lose any access of free trade access to the US. I think it oversimplifies a little bit the challenges and the opportunities that we have as exporters. One of the challenge for sure is, as I was saying, growing our exports. So we have a target of growing to $75 billion worth of exports by 2025, going from the 64 billion or so that we're at right now. That's something that's going to be a challenge to sustain over the next few years. But is also the challenge is to diversify the export base. And I'm going to argue that this would not be possible without CUSMA. So CUSMA is a necessary condition to diversify the export base in Canada. And then we know this because we've learned quite a bit in terms of how these aggregate trade flows are determined. We've learned more about that, focusing on the micro data, the firm level decisions that are made at the firm level in terms of what results in the patterns and the trade patterns that we're witnessing, right? And we know one thing is that if we're going to increase exports, we're going to have to increase the export intensity. So that's the share of what we export with regards to overall sales. But we also know that the firms that are successfully diversifying the export base are the ones that have high export intensity. So if you look at some of the potential to grow exports in Canada, it is within the small to medium sized businesses that perhaps are not exporting at all, or have a small export, or just sort of testing the waters when it comes to export. And then there's nothing, the really great place to start is in the US market. So if you can raise the export intensity of these firms, I think that's a condition to leading to more diversification. And so ironically, in a sense, without all this discussion and threats of withdrawing, the US withdrawing from Nafta, and the discussion around, we need to diversify our export base, I think we needed CUSMA. And then once you have secured a transparent, predictable market access in the US, then you can start leveraging these other trade agreements, CETA, the trade deal with Europe, and CPTPP. Of course, in terms of concessions, Canada has had to make some concessions when it comes to ag and food, especially when it comes to supply managed sectors. I'm sure that we're going to have a chance to talk about these sectors in more details later on. But I do think that while the new NAFTA calls for some significant adjustments in the supply managed sectors, I am confident that we're going to manage to operate a transition towards this new normal in a way that will preserve the profitability of these sectors. And so that's not going to be without challenges, but I think the industry is up to it, especially given some of the adjustments that have been made in the last couple of years. So I'll turn it over to you, Al, and just looking forward to some great discussions and questions.
Thanks very much, JP. And just a quick thing, I think I'd build on a couple of our panelists mentioned exports. I wouldn't want to lose sight of imports either. You look at from the Canadian perspective, depend very heavily on the United States and Mexico for imports off season of fresh fruits and vegetables. Another example, you look at oats, extruded oats products. The breakfast cereal chain, food manufacturing in the United States depends heavily on those imports of oats that come from the Canadian prairies. So we don't want to lose sight of that. I want to go back to the panel with a couple of questions. First of all, I'm going to start with Joe Glauber on this. Thinking back to late 2016, what do you think some of the key issues were in agriculture and food policy for Canada and the US in the renewal of NAFTA? And how do you think these agendas have changed now with all of these other events that we've been discussing? Does that put more pressure on USMCA to deliver something, or how has that changed? And maybe we'll start with Joe, then go to Darren, and come back to JP.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Al. I think as I said earlier, the focus in 2016, certainly the interesting thing, of course, is the candidates at the time. President Trump was campaigning against TPP, but also was, the two leading candidates for the Democratic nomination, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. But frankly, that's where the interest was for U.S. agriculture, was getting TPP passed through Congress. And it was there, I think people were looking to modernize NAFTA through the provisions of TPP. Now, when the president pulled out of TPP almost, I think, in the first week of in office, and immediately the interests of U.S. Ag were kind of in damage control. Okay, well, if we're out of that, then what, and particularly when the rest of the 11 went on to get CPTPP, all of a sudden the U.S. was at a disadvantage because Canada and others were going to get better access into Japan, better access into Vietnam, markets that the U.S. was really looking forward to. So I think there's been a lot of pressure to get this trade deal with Japan on that's going to at least help try to level the access to TPP. There's interest in getting that in Vietnam. And then the other thing was the very real threat, I think, of the president pulling out of NAFTA. And there, I think, again, Darren said it best, the mantra was just do no harm. Make sure that the access we have in NAFTA is maintained. Now, you did see what bubbled up from that were people who saw cracks saying, okay, well, maybe this is our chance. Maybe we can get something more favorable here, or in the sense of, and here I'm thinking favorable in the sense of being more protectionist. And I think most of those were beat back. I like both the comments that have been made on imports. I think they are very important. You look at a livestock industry that's really depends a lot on a very well integrated market. But I think all of those problems that were out there before, that are function even with a well-working trade agreement like NAFTA, we're always going to have these sort of border frictions on various products, and those are going to continue. What bothers me is sort of the continued unilateralism that we've seen on, the renewal of the aluminum tariffs and things like that. But it's just not good to walk away from a trade agreement, sign a trade agreement, and then 3 months later, start having trade actions against another country. But I think NAFTA is going to, I think that NAFTA will continue to work like it's worked. Canada is going to continue to be our largest, if not one of our two largest trading partners, and as far as agriculture is concerned.
Very good. Thanks, Joe. Darren?
Yeah, Al, I'm glad that you brought up imports. I wish I would have had time to bring up imports. I wanted to try to lay out some export data really quickly to provide some context, but I just briefly want to talk about the importance of agriculture imports as relates to Canada and Mexico. And particularly, both Canada and Mexico provide the U.S. a significant amount of fresh fruits and vegetables. And really, Mexico, I think in 2015, provided 44% or so of the imported fresh fruits and vegetables. Imports are really critical. I think it's a side of the equation that gets left out a lot. And unfortunately, I kind of knew I was doing that at the time, but I figured I'd be able to address it. And so here's my chance. I think imports are critical because I think when we think about trade, we need to think about the impact it also has on American families, consumers, about making sure that American families have better quality choices, more choices, lower price food. And that's what we see when we see the trade among the countries. And one of the concerns is when you start to restrict and create barriers for the imports, and especially for things like nutritious food, like fruits and vegetables, it has a disproportionate impact on low-income households, because a greater share of the income from these low-income households goes towards the purchase of food as compared to higher income households. So that's something to bear in mind as we talk about trade. We shouldn't just think along the lines of just farmers or ranchers, but just how it impacts everybody across the board. And as it relates to kind of like what the agenda was in 2016, I'm just gonna, if I look at the USTR summary of NAFTA renegotiation objectives, which is the document they put out, I mean, it was fairly general. There was they said they had a general desire to maintain the reciprocal duty-free market access for agriculture goods that we had, and also certainly to expand market access. And then there was a pretty significant focus on these non-tariff trade barriers, that a couple that I mentioned, such as the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and there are others as well. And I think what's important, and I brought up, is that, and I don't know whether or not this was an objective or not, but it certainly should be, is that through the USMCA and through these provisions dealing with agricultural biotechnology and sanitary and phytosanitary measures and other non-tariff trade barriers, that the US, along with Canada and Mexico, start to change the rules of the game a little bit. There are certain things that the EU addresses in ways that are different than the US does. That relates to certain things called geographical indications, which are kind of like common names like Parmesan cheese. And, there's a kind of desire in the EU to keep that as that you can't use these common names, whereas the US, that becomes a generic term, and we don't believe it should have. Basically, it loses kind of the geographic connotation to the name. And that's actually a bigger issue than it might appear, because a lot of people are concerned about it. And it's going to be an issue moving forward. And it's good that through the USMCA, we can address issues like that. And I think that when we talk about kind of the changing nature right now of what's going on, we can't ignore the pandemic. The pandemic certainly, I don't know practically how the US government then is going to change its policies as it relates to the pandemic, but certainly as a matter of good policy, the last thing we want to do is hinder food supply chains. That's the last thing we want to do. There's sometimes a desire to try to kind of hoard food or limit exports or try to protect industries. I hope that we don't go down that road. I don't think we will. Some countries have done that a little bit, but not as much as maybe feared as a result of the pandemic. But I think we also need to kind of bear in mind the impact that the pandemic has, and make sure that we don't hinder food supply chains right now.
Very good. Thanks, thanks, Darren. Quickly, JP.
Yeah, just real briefly. I mean, I did allude to that I believe that at the time, 2016, the most pressing agri-food policy agenda in Canada was around growth. And it was quite clear in my head that the growth objectives would be centered around innovation and market access. And so, hence the trade negotiations with Europe, CPTPP, and the critical deal that we, the fact that we ratified with the US, the new Nafta. So I think that's evolved in the right direction. And I think we're setting up for ourselves for being able to achieve or meet some of the targets that we had. I mean, one of the things I'll point out real quick is those policy issues that are showing up in the US, they make their way into the discussion for sure in Canada, right? I'm just going to use price discovery as an example, right? The idea or the discussion around whether or not the prices that we use for in some of the livestock supply chains are actually representative of the supply and demand conditions that we find in the marketplace. Imagine a world in which, and that's an issue that we face as well, and imagine a world in which you would have an integrated supply chain, but with flows of products being impeded in any way because of tariffs, because of non-tariff barriers. It would make the challenge of sorting out, what kind of price signal should we be using in the supply chain to make our decisions a lot more complicated. So the policy issues, whether it's market felicitation payments and a lot of the different policy issues that you find in the US are inviting themselves in the Canadian discussion. And I think CUSMA facilitates, it doesn't make it easy, but certainly improves coordination along the supply chain.
Thanks very much, JP. I want to jump ahead with another question, and maybe JP, if you don't mind, we'll stick with you and kind of go back through the order in reverse here. Prior to 2018, the U.S. and Canada shared very similar levels of producer support in agriculture, at least the way the OECD measures it. Both countries were ranging in around 8% of farm cash receipts as support. With the advent of the market facilitation payments, the U.S. has jumped up sharply now to over 12% of farm cash receipts. Canada's just about unchanged, in around 7 to 8%. what kind of pressures do you think this creates between the two countries with, mostly free trade with the exception of some fairly isolated sectors under USMCA and this divergence in support? What do you think about that, and what are some of your concerns if you have them?
Well, I do think that we have divergence in the level of support. I would say that we have divergence as well in terms of the objectives that are pursued when it comes to ag policy. I mean, business risk management in Canada has been an issue for a number of years. I mean, we went through a first formal round of review and didn't come up with any type of significant changes. And so we still have ongoing discussions. And as I said in my earlier remark, discussions of what's going on in the US is inviting itself into the discussions that we have. I think it's quite clear in Canada that we want to have a business risk management that is centered around stability of farm income. When we have direct payments, I think that's most associated with supporting income. And I think, there's definitely at the government level an emphasis on making sure that what we have in terms of business risk management is geared towards stabilizing income. And I think for the most part, I would expect that we continue to work with farm level margin insurance programs that are non-distorting as much as we can. I mean, I think the concern, I believe, from the industry standpoint is that these types of programs are slow, unpredictable as well, and slow to actually act when there are some disruptions, just like we've had. I mean, one of the things that we had to deal with. I mean, we made reference to a number of times in this presentation to the challenges that the U.S. had with China. I mean, we've had our own challenges in terms of market access and disruptions when it comes to trade with China, and part of the programs that we have are not meant right now to deal with trade disruptions. And I think that would be the one concern in Canada right now, is how do we deal with these trade disruptions going forward?
Very good. Thanks, JP. Darren, thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think the key question is, are we looking at a kind of an aberration and a temporary issue, or is this going to be a long-term issue? I mean, generally the U.S. has a lower percentage than it does now, but we have this, $14 billion or so, whatever, market facilitation payments. And question, is this going to keep moving? Are we going to continue to have the trade aid? Is that going to be baked into foreign policy or not? And one of my big concerns right now is, not to get too in the weeds, but there's something called the Commodity Credit Corporation here in the US, and it's the funding mechanism by which farm programs get kind of paid for in the US. That excludes crop insurance. And that limit is about $30 billion. It is $30 billion. In general, the USDA secretary he has a lot of discretion on how he can use whatever money is unrestricted. But most of the money is generally kind of appropriated through Congress, specifically appropriated. And then the secretary has some leeway. And that's where the trade aid money is coming from. It's through the CCC authority. Generally speaking, before the trade aid situation, it wasn't looked upon favorably to use this power too much, this discretionary authority that the secretary had to kind of basically spend money however they want to address whatever issue they want to in ag. There's been some legislation introduced in Congress that would actually codify in law, expanding the amount of spending, and just to simplify it, the CCC related spending could go from 30 billion all the way up to 68 billion. Now that's a concern because the specifically authorized programs in the US are, let's say, 15 billion or so. You're winding up giving the USDA secretary 50 billion or so unrestricted money that can be used for discretionary purposes. So moving forward, the question is, would the secretary use all that money? And if so, then we would completely be changing the whole dynamic of foreign policy in the US. And I think completely change the whole game when it comes to kind of the trade relationships as well. So we've been pushing back on this whole idea of expanding the CCC kind of authority.
Yes, and that quite apart from the U.S.'s WTO obligations with regard to most distorting support. And Joe, you've done some work in that area. I wonder if you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Al. Two things. One is that, a lot of U.S. programs are counter-cyclical in nature, that they respond to lower prices. We have higher payments, lower revenues, higher payments, lower yields, higher payments. And so given where prices have been, not surprising, some of the major commodity programs that exist through the Farm Bill had already shown or have started to show increases. But what we've seen over the last 3 years, I think, is really unprecedented because we're really talking about authorities. Darren mentioned them through the Commodity Credit Corporation, which just haven't been used like they've been used, that we've seen used through the trade aid payments, which again topped about $28 billion over 2 years. And now the supplemental support for COVID. There's talk now of a new program being announced right after Labor Day, which could authorize as much as $14 billion or so into payments for farmers. I mean, there's no question farmers have been hurt by COVID. They were hurt by trade aid payments, but all these monies are on top of existing programs. So existing price and income support programs, existing revenue insurance programs, and other things that in some cases are paying over losses over several payments. It's not surprising you have producers wondering what's going to happen in 2021. And already we see people saying, well, maybe this should be somehow captured in farm spending, future farm spending. We're going to be over our WTO limits in 2019. I think if these new monies are spent in 2020 or that come out in 2020 after Labor Day, we very well could be over in 2020 as well. And that's going to get a lot of attention. And frankly, I think that's attention the US doesn't want in the WTO. I mean, yes, the dispute settlement process right now is broken because of the appellate body, but I think it tarnishes our reputation abroad. And I think that we really need to think very, very hard about, as Darren pointed out, using these authorities to broaden these authorities, because I think that would be a real mistake.
Very good point. Chrissy, I want to check in with you to see if we've got some questions from our registrants, because we're, I think, about 5 minutes or thereabouts remaining.
Yeah, we've got quite a few really good questions, but so we won't have time to get to all of them. But let me read one for you now. This is from the audience. The Canadian government is very hesitant to improve business risk management programs for Canadian farmers. Often cited is that this support can't be given as it may be counter-viable by the US. With US providing $32 billion to US farmers due to trade injury, is there opportunity for Canadian government to safely support Canadian farmers at a higher level? Any input on that?
Maybe we'll just throw that one maybe to JP, see what your thoughts are on that.
Real quick, I know we're pressed for time. I know that there is a desire to keep these programs in line with our trade commitments and trade obligations, whether at the WTO or as part of those trade deals. So I do think that there is a strong desire to keep those programs consistent with the trade obligations. I don't expect them to change in that way. In terms of the level of support, what has transpired so far from the negotiations between the federal government and the different levels of provincial governments is that any type of reforms has to be budget neutral. And that's been a principle that has been mentioned a number of times in all the communications. And so I would suspect that when we look at any type of reform in the RM long term, this is going to be budget neutral on the Canadian side.
Okay, thanks, JP. It does make you wonder from the Canadian side how this is all sustainable. But I guess that's yet to be seen. Chrissy, maybe a couple more questions if we have time for them.
Yep. So any advice for farmers to leverage this information to really be in a position that we need to be in? So any kind of practical advice?
Maybe Joe, could we start with you on that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I think these are certainly tough times for agriculture. I think at least the pandemic has really presented some real challenges in trying to get these systems back and to see prices start to rebound. That's going to be the real key thing. I do think it's important to keep pressure on governments to pursue trade liberalization and really seek broader, trade agreements and things like that, because I think both Canada and the U.S., the future of these countries in terms of the agricultural sectors are, continue to be exports and growth in the world economy. So I think, I look at it from the U.S. standpoint. I think, getting back to the negotiating table is a real important thing.
For farmers, it seems like a good time to have a lot of money in the piggy bank there, just because the working capital to carry through all this volatility must be hard to come by. Chrissy, do we have one more we can fit in?
Yep, I think so. Is this a good time for Canada to begin negotiations with other countries to strengthen our position?
Okay. Who would like to take this one on?
Well, you can get started on that one, Al. I know you've written on the topic for a number of times.
Well, I guess real briefly, if you look at the extent to which Canada is leveraged towards ag and food exports versus the U.S., the U.S. has a great deal more arable land and output and so on. But of course, a population of roughly 10 times greater than that of Canada. Canada's ag output outstrips its domestic population to feed quite significantly. So that trade needs to occur. And we've wondered, in these volatile times where every day it seems like food security is becoming more and more of an issue, perhaps particularly with China, but elsewhere as well. Maybe there's an opportunity for Canada to, on a bilateral basis, still continuing to work on multilateral fronts, because that's in the Canadian interest, but perhaps to match up with individual countries in some way that could meet some of their food security needs and meet some of the Canadian needs for a sustainable market access. Maybe I'll stop there. Do we have time for one more, Chrissy?
Nope, that's it. I've got to get over to the next topic, but I really appreciate your time. What a great discussion, and I've learned a lot through this journey that we've had together over the last couple of months, and hopefully everybody else did too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much to our panelists and for all the registrants, and I hope this was informative.
So thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.